morning, YouTube. So this video is going to cover how to build the step stool drawer. We're going to cover cutting the grooves in the drawer sides along with the dados, the rabbet, and the rabbet dado parts that will be constructed today. So with that said, let's get to it. So the first operation I have to do is I have to calculate the distance from the top of this dado down and subtract the 16th. The reason why is I don't want my drawer running in contact with the step because over time they'll get stuck. I want a 16th inch space. So what I'm going to do is I can take a square and measure from the bottom to the top of the dado, which is 1 and 2, 3, 4, 1 and 5/16, which I'd go down to 1 and 4/16, or I could use my combination square and do the same thing. So let me just flip this around. So yeah, so it would be 1 inch and a quarter. So the distance for the dado to be cut from the fence to the inside of the blade would be 1 1/4. Now, there are a few ways we can cut it. We can cut it on the table saw, or we can cut it on the router table. I'm personally going to do it on the router table because I'm going to save the table saw for the rabbet cuts we're going to do for the front. So with that said, let's get to it. So before I set my fence, I want to set the blade height for the router table. And since my sides are 1/2 inch, I only want to go up 1/4 inch. So half of a half is 1/4. So I want to set this blade height to 1/4 inch. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my digital calipers to set it. So I'm going to set it to, on the calipers, 1/4 inch from 0. So let me zero it first. Alright, now work our way up to 1/4 inch. The other way I could do it is, actually I could set 1/4 inch on this. And then do the same here. 1/4 inch. Lock that in. If you can't see, so I just used my calipers to set the blade height to exactly 1/4 inch. Turn that off. Then I would take my combination square and I would set it to 1 and 1/4 inch from the point of the blade to the fence. So that distance is what I measured over there. Alright, and remember that's minus the 16th, so it doesn't ride on my drawer top. Now, the other thing I did real quick is I'm just going to check to make sure the fence is square to the edge of the table and it's parallel to the miter slab, which it is. Alright, now as I said before, I'm going to do this on a test piece. So this piece is the same thickness as the other pieces we cut the other day. So instead of wasting or actually ruining my good pieces, I'm going to see if my stuff is set up correctly with this one, and then if everything's good, I'll run the other pieces. Again, this saves me both time and going through the motions again for other pieces. So let's see how it goes. There we go. Now we're going to go see how it fits on our step stool. was off by 1/16 of an inch. So I actually went, instead of 1 1/4, I did 1 3/16 from the top of the dado to the bench. And now what I'm going to do is now I'm going to go cut the grooves in both my side pieces, and then we can start working on rabbiting and dadoing for the other components. So let's get to it. Side pieces fit really nice. So if I line up these two groove cuts, which they are dados, but again, since they're going with the grain, they're called a groove cut. When I line them up perfectly, there's a nice consistent space on the top half of the drawer, so I won't get stuck. So now that I've cut these, now I can start looking to do the dado in the back for the back of the drawer. So with that said, let's get to it. So for this rear piece, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in for the dado from the end, 1/2 inch for the front half of the dado. Or the easy way to remember is that since this is half, or it's supposed to be 1/2 inch, I'm going to come a full inch in from the back side of the blade to the fence. So from here to the fence should be about 1 inch total. Now, I just cut this, and my back piece doesn't fit in this groove, so it's slightly bigger. So I got two options. Either I continue to plane this down until it fits perfectly in this space, or I make the dado in the back bigger. All right. The other option is I could actually cut what's called a dado rabbit. So I would get a smaller dado bit. I cut a dado in this piece, and then I cut a rabbit on this one, and they'd lock together. But for the sake of our class, we're just going to do simple dado in the back. So I'm going to set this up from here to the fence to 1 inch, and then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take out my planer, and I'm planing this down after I've cut my dados to see if they fit perfect. So with that said, let's get to it. So one thing I forgot to mention is to create a left and a right piece, all right, I want the groove touching my micro jig on one, and then on the other, I want the groove facing away, so that no matter what, I can get a left and a right piece. So again, just remember, you need to alternate your pieces in order to get your left and right dado correct. So let me keep working. And there we go, we got our rear dado for the back of the drawer. Now the front, I'm not going to put a dado in, because for the front of the drawer we're just going to use a rabbit. So this is all I need to do for now on my two side pieces. So now I have to plane my rear piece to fit perfectly in that dado. So with that said, let's bust out the planer. So to get a perfect fit, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have my dado right next to me, and each pass I'm going to test it. So my dado is going to be the gauge instead of my combination square. Now that yielded a perfect fit. So now I can move on to cutting the rabbet in the front of the drawer. So I put my parts together and I squared up the edges and I measured 11 5/8 for the interior. So for this piece to fit in, all right, I need to subtract a rabbet that creates an interior face of 11 5/8. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a 1/2 inch deep, so I'm going to mark 1/2 inch deep, so 1/2 inch in, and if this is 3/4, 3/8 up for the rabbet. This will ensure that my drawer front is flush to the front while also fitting perfectly. So I'm going to lay that out using my combination square. So from the end grain coming in, it's going to be 1/2 inch. So I'll mark that with my pencil real quick. So I marked with Sharpie what I'm going to subtract. So I'm going to come up 1/2 inch, up 3/8, and in 1/2 inch. So I measured from here to here, and I got that measurement, which is 11 5/8. So with that said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go set up the table saw for cutting our rabbet. So let's do it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to set my blade height to 3/8 of an inch, because that's how deep I want to go. So I'm going to set it to 3/8, my combination square, and then I'm going to lower the blade until the bubble lines up in the center of my combination square, which tells me that it's exactly 3/8 of an inch. There we go. Lock it in place. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a dado stop jig for my rabbet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the farthest nose of my jig to exactly what I'm going to cut on the inside, and then I'm going to slowly move it out from there. So step 1 will be my first cut, and then will be where I can reference for my final cut. But again, it's just easier just to go cut and then clean from there. So let's just set this up. So this should be 1/2 inch from the outside of the blade. So I'm actually moving my stop a little bit closer. All right, so 1/2 inch from the outside of the blade. Contact. Lock. Check for shifting. All right. Now again, I can practice with a scrap piece, which I am going to do. I'm going to use the mahogany piece I done goofed on last time to make sure that I cut it to the right measurement. So this is the mahogany piece I messed up last time, so I'm going to use that as my test piece. And see how it fits. Now, I'm off by the slightest amount. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to reset the fence so that when I cut this, my side piece fits perfectly flush on the inside. So what I'm going to do, actually I want to go the other way. I'm going to move the fence out. So I'm just going to gently tap it. And then cut. And there we go. We got a nice fit. All right? So now, I want to make sure that I want my bad face, which is this one, faces down as I make my cuts. So with that said, let's make our rabbit. Now we have the full entire drawer. So the last step we're going to do before we glue up today is we need to cut the groove or the dado in the bottom of all 4 pieces so we can put a drawer bottom in. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually come back to the table saw. I'm going to show you a cool trick of how to cut a groove that fits exactly to the panel material you're going to use for your drawer bottom. So let's get to it. So when it comes to the blade height, I want it to be the same as the dado in the back. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my combination square, put it in my dado, press it flat, and lock it in. And that is exactly how high I want the blade to be. Raise the blade. All right. Now, about a half an inch from the inside of the blade to the fence. All right, so that first cut I'll run through on all 4 pieces, and then I'm going to loosen the fence and then tap it in and slowly cut enough of material away that I can slide my material from my drawer into my groove without too much slop moving around. So with that said, here's another thing I got to be careful about. So for the front and the back piece, it doesn't matter what edge you cut with. In this one, I'm trying to cut out this defect, so this edge has to go against the fence. And then on this one, I personally like this edge the most, so I want that away from the fence. So again, these are my cutting edges. When it comes to my left and my right piece though, it does matter how they go in. So again, the smaller gap is the top of the drawer, so I'm going to cut on the bottom. So this is the edge I'm going to cut on. I'm going to take the 2 pieces, I'm going to compress them down and flip it around to the edge they want to feed them in. So that is the order. So for one of them, the dado is going to go first as I run through, and then for the second one, the dado is going to go through on the back end. So one other thing I'm going to do too is I'm actually going to move my ripping fence a little closer to the opposite side of the edge, because all I'm doing is I'm just cutting a groove. All right? I don't need to use my ripping fence to prevent kickback, because all I'm doing is I'm just cutting a clean straight edge. So let me slide this up and let's get to it. Now in this operation, I'm actually going to treat the table saw like a router table. I'm going to stand on the left side and I'm going to feed from left to right. Again, I'm taking my 2 hands and I'm pressing down and into the fence, going from right to left. Right? I don't have to worry about my fingers so much being right here, because again, it's a groove cut, not a through cut. So if I press against the fence, I'm not going to catch the blade and cause it to kick back. So with that said, let's get to it. close, so we're going to have to do this a couple times. Perfect fit. Now that I have all my pieces dadoed, rabbited, and grooved, it's time to do the math for the drawer bottom itself. All right? So we need to cut this to fit inside of our groove. So the good news is the math is easy, because we want this back piece to be the exact same width as my panel. So whatever this is in length, that is going to be the width of our panel. And it comes out to be exactly 12 inches. So the width of this panel is going to be ripped to 12 inches. Now the length, so the distance from here to here, and the fit in the groove, so what you want to think of is you want to take this number here. So let's take the ruler out. So I want to take 11 5/8 in length, and then add whatever the two grooves in the front and the back are. So I'm going to take those two grooves, take my ruler, and I want to add a 1/2 inch. If we take 11 5/8, which is 0.625, and then add a 1/2 inch, which is 0.5, we get 12.125. So we take 0.125, math, frac, so it's 12 1/8 is the length of my bottom piece. So with that said, let's go to the table saw and cut it. So for the drawer bottom, since it is a piece of man-made material where material is stacked in opposite grain directions, it won't matter if I cross-cut or I rip on my table saw, because again, no matter what, I always have grain going in the opposite direction. So what I do have is I have a blade in my table saw that is meant for plywood, so I won't have to worry about tear out when I'm going across or with the grain itself. With that said, it's also been pre-squared already, so I don't need to use the jointer to square this material up. So with that said, I've set my blade from the inside tooth to the fence to the final width, which is 12 inches. So I'll rip this down, then I'll rotate 90 degrees, I'll reset to 12 1/8, and then cut that piece. So with that said, let's get to it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my block plane and I'm just going to gently taper the edges so that they slide into my dados a lot nicer. So I was off by a little bit, but I tuned everything up, and now the entire drawer fits together. Now let's see if it fits in the step stool one more time. we go. So what's going to happen next time is we're going to pre-finish the entire drawer, glue it up, and then make the runners at the same time. So with that said, these kinds of videos, and let's make stuff. Bye.